Syrian civil war really get amplified towards we're looking at from like 2012 leaning all the way up until about the end of 2015. That was obviously the most bloody conflict, I would argue, in the world over the last 15 years. At the moment, or I would say about in the last 5 years, the conflict had slowed down quite a bit, and most of the fighting was actually taking place between Turkish groups and Kurdish groups, and then between American forces and Iranian backed militias. But that all changed on November 27th, so last week, while a lot of Americans were enjoying Thanksgiving. The largest offensive was kicked off in Syria that has taken place dating back all the way to 2019. This offensive has effectively turned Syria into the battlefield on scale, into the battlefield that it was at prior to 2019 in Syria. And so right now, it's effectively a gigantic soup sandwich of regional and international actors that have dozens and dozens of bases, and there are tons of groups that are all operating on behalf of different regional actors and international actors within Syria for their specific interest. So, what happened specifically with this offensive? So, the main thing with the offensive was we had coming out of the region of Idlib in Syria, we had a group that is known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. HTS is the largest group right now that is in the middle of leading the current offensive. If that doesn't sound familiar to you, that's because it's a relatively new group. They rebranded from what they were back in the day. Back in the day, they were a little known Al Qaeda affiliate within Syria that was known as the Al Nusra Front. And they were effectively the Al Qaeda affiliate in Syria that was responsible for operating exclusively inside of Syria. They rebranded and they denounced their ties with, or they had a split from Al Qaeda in 2016. And since then, they have actually been focusing on basically rebuilding, gaining a stronger presence in the Idlib region, and in more recent times, actually focusing more on governance. So looking a little bit more like what a group like Hezbollah would look like in Lebanon than like a traditional terrorist organization would. So this group, HTS, they left out of Idlib in a surprise attack, and they managed to take control over the second largest, depending on which numbers you look at, the second largest city in Syria, which is the well-known, heavily damaged and embattled city of Aleppo in Syria. Um, After they had taken Aleppo, they immediately bolted south down a major highway in Syria that is known as M5. M5 is critical logistics within Syria because M5 stretches all the way from the northernmost part of northwestern Syria all the way down through all of the major cities, first hitting Hama, then Homs, and then the Syrian capital city of Damascus. Now, at the moment, HTS has managed to conquer every major city down to Hama, and it is assessed that they aren't far, or are at least progressing towards Homs at the moment, with the intent to also have an assault to try to conquer Homs. That is very important at the moment because if they were to take Homs, they would effectively isolate the Syrian government from its Alawite supporters that live in the Mediterranean region of Syria. And it would also isolate the city of Damascus from its ship to shore resupply opportunities that it gets from the Russian government, which owns its only major deep water naval base in the port of Tartus, which is also on the Mediterranean Sea. So that is HTS and what they have done in this conflict. Now, another group has also been involved in this offensive, but this group is more directly affiliated with the Turkish government, and that group is called the Syrian National Army, or the SNA. So back in the day, if you had heard of a group known as the Free Syrian Army, there are small factions within the Free Syrian Army, along with some other groups, basically came together towards the end of 2019 and around 2020, and they just have created this new group that's known as the SNA, and they are directly controlled and work closely in coordination with the Turkish military. This group is important because this group, once Aleppo had been taken, they began to move after specifically Kurdish groups like the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, in the areas that are to the west or to the east of Aleppo and taking on a lot of Kurdish towns. Now, in the past, the SNA has directly participated in Kurdish military operations to establish a lot of areas of northern Syria where the Kurdish army has basically seized it in order to give themselves a buffer and an operating area so that they can go after various Kurdish groups, which they deem as their number one national security threat. So you've got to remember in this battlefield, although the United States is backing the Kurdish group known as, or the SDF, which is mostly made up of Kurds, for the country of Turkey, their primary national interest in Syria is defeating Kurdish groups because their largest terrorist threat is a group inside of Turkey that is known as the PKK. And the PKK is closely aligned with a lot of these Kurdish groups that are also operating in Syria as well as within Iraq. And so, if we were to go ahead and zoom out just a little bit, we can see a lot of our regional and national interests that are being acted upon utilizing these various fighting groups within Syria. First of which is going to be Turkey, which is going to likely use these groups, all the gains that they're making, all kinds of gains in northern Syria. They're going to use those in order to consolidate Turkish power and effectively give them a greater foothold in northern Syria to combat some of these Turkish or some of these Kurdish groups. And then to back up just a little bit more from that, so if we were to flip this around, still talking about direct belligerence and talk about who is actually on the other side of this, the folks that are backing Syria from a regional perspective are primarily their I would say the Shia Islam alliance across the region is directly involved in defending the government of Assad at the moment. And so what that means is it's Iran through the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, primarily the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, which used to be led by Qasem Soleimani. You know, scoff, not with us anymore. But so you have these Iranian aligned militia groups in the Iranian government. They are directly backing the Assad regime all throughout Syria, along with the Russians. So what's Iran's interest? So the strategic interest of Iran is to maintain influence and a presence in Syria so that they have striking range or they have a striking distance on the country of Israel, but then they also have a land bridge to resupply their tight alliance, their alliance with the with Lebanese Hezbollah, which has been getting wrecked by the Israelis in the last couple of months. But right now they're effectively getting stiff-armed away from that. But that's one of their main interests and one of their main reasons why they need the Assad regime to stay in power is because of that land bridge to get to their allies and to maintain that stronghold on Israel's doorstep. So that covers Iran and Turkey. They are two of the main backers of the direct belligerents that are involved in this conflict. Now, there's one last group that I do want to talk about, and that is the Sunni Arab interest in the region that have, in this specific circumstance, they're actually backing Bashar al-Assad. That's interesting because throughout the duration of the Syrian civil war, what you saw playing out in Syria was a conflict between a lot of quasi-Sunni Arab interest trying to battle and be at odds with a lot of Shia Islam Iranian-backed interests that were represented by Assad, Lebanese Hezbollah, and a lot of these Iranian militias. So you had these Sunni Arab countries that were going all in to try to remove the Assad regime. Well, right now, they're not doing that. They're actually making statements in support of Assad. And this shouldn't really surprise anyone, even though it seems a little bit odd, because they've welcomed Assad back into the Arab League about a year ago. And so what you really see being reflected right now is instead of in the past, whenever it was a Sunni Shia struggle with Sunni Arab states battling Iranian-backed Shia states with Syria as its battleground, what you see represented right now, although not nearly as boldly as that conflict was, is Arab Sunni states that appear to be potentially more concerned with growing Turkish influence in the region and not necessarily Iranian and Syrian and Russian influence in the region, which would explain their stances. Now, the last thing that I want to touch on, and arguably the most important thing for us because we're Americans, is where are the Americans in this whole thing and where do our interests lie? So American forces are throughout Syria, but they're primarily on the eastern side of the Euphrates River, and they're embedded with the SDF, which is that mostly Kurdish fighting force. One hotspot in particular where there's been a lot of fighting taking place right recently has been in a city known as Deir ez-Zor, which is on the Euphrates River, but closer to the Syrian-Iraq border. Um, in that instance, you actually have a third, I guess, major front in this conflict because there the belligerents are all different. You have the Syrian Democratic Forces at odds and a standoff at the Euphrates River in the city of Deir ez-Zor with Iranian-aligned militia groups and the Syrian government, and you have American forces actively providing close air support as well as other defensive capabilities to defend our interest in the SDF. The final point that I want to make about this, as an American, if you're looking at this conflict and you're wondering what is our primary interest, one thing that I would mention is that we have a whole lot of interest in Syria that stem from who our allies are in the region and what their goals are. But one thing that all Americans should be worried about is that in a country like Syria, the most dangerous and most direct threat to the United States is when that country becomes a region of disorder and lawlessness, or effectively a giant failed state. And the reason for that is because a failed state becomes a breeding ground where you could have Salafist or Islamist groups training and planning under the noise floor of the rest of the chaos to go and conduct attacks everywhere else in the world. And so from the United States perspective, we have to support and defend our allies that are fighting there. But the other thing is we have to support a solution that will restore order and governance so that a lot of these terrorist groups that are direct threats to the United States don't find a safe haven to be able to launch attacks against us from.